Now let's turn our attention to White House correspondent with Voice of America, Anita Powell. Anita, thank you for joining us on the news this hour. You mentioned earlier that you could see the White House from where you are. I'm wondering what is happening within those walls. You think they're comfortable with how Americans are voting right now, or they have their hearts in their mouth?
I think it's a combination. Yes, I am indeed in the White House. I'm actually in the basement of the White House right now. It's quite calm here. We're kind of in the center of the political hurricane. And of course, Americans have very strong feelings about who they think should be the next president of the United States. The polls all indicate that it's a very tight race. So as you say, some people do have their hearts in their mouths right now, and some people are very excited about the possibility for change. What's kind of interesting about this election is no matter what, we're getting a new president come January 20th. It's not going to be Joe Biden anymore. And I think Americans are very deeply divided on who they think that next person should be. But I think there's a lot of excitement and a lot of anxiety as well.
And it's either Trump returns, so we have the first female president. But narrow victories, they say, may also mean recount, and that the waiting time for this election result might be longer than usual. What does this mean based on the things you've observed?
Right. So just about the count, that is not for nefarious reasons necessarily. I know that there's a lot of shade thrown about why it's going to take so long to count this. But one reason is by law in the state of Pennsylvania, which is a key swing state, they're not allowed to start counting mail-in votes until after polls close at 7 p.m. It's only 1 p.m. right now. So it is going to take a little bit of time. It could take a few days for us to get solid counts. And we can also expect maybe some challenges from those who aren't happy about the counts, and those are going to have to be settled in court. So this is going to take some time before Americans know who the next president of the United States is. But I just want to clarify that election officials across the country have not reported any widespread problems at this hour. We've seen very healthy voter turnout. We've seen actually very large voter turnout and early voter turnout in key states like Georgia and North Carolina. So far, we've had a glut of voters and a lot of work for these very hardworking election officials to do once polls close at 7 p.m. tonight.
There were conversations, Anita, about how keenly contested this election is. I'm just wondering what happens if there's a tie. It's happened once before, but that was over 200 years ago. Is that even a conceivable possibility in this exercise?
Well, okay, so there's 538 electoral votes, but it's not evenly split. That would be some really complex math, I think. Whoever gets to 71st is going to be the winner. I guess I could do the math in such a way that it were to be tied, but I'm not sure how that would look and whether that would be likely. I think it's clear to say, like, I think it's pretty unlikely that the 538 votes are going to be evenly split down the middle. I do think one of the candidates is going to get to 270, and the other one is not.
Absolutely. What we understand thousands of miles away from America is that if no candidate reaches the 270 votes needed to win this election, that Congress will now have to pick the president, and then the senators will decide who the vice president is. So in the case of a continental election, we're hearing that that's probably going to favor the Republican candidates. Do you agree?
Wow. I mean, that's going to depend. Yeah, I mean, that's going to depend on the balance of the House and the Senate. But I can see that argument, and I have seen that scenario played out. But again, I'm not sure. Like, let's let the votes get counted first before we start thinking of those scenarios, because that's a pretty unusual scenario that we may or may not have to deal with. But yes, you are right. This would be settled by our legislative branch. But I think that's a bridge that we're quite a ways from crossing at this time. I think what we are going to have is we're going to have a win for somebody in the next few days. I don't think it's likely that we're going to have an even split, because the numbers don't really work that elegantly.
Absolutely. There are international concerns about who emerges in this election, especially how it affects the war in Gaza and peace in the Middle East. How important are these factors for voters today?
It depends who you ask. I mean, there are 330 million Americans and growing Some of them care very deeply about the conflict in the Middle East. We're seeing a big campaign, for example, in Michigan that opposes the Biden administration and by extension the Harris administration's support of Israel. And those voters could play a very key role in this election. Likewise, the candidates have very different views on the conflict in Ukraine. Both want it to end, but they don't agree on how. And that could play into how voters behave at the polls. But there are a number of issues that people feel very strongly about that could also shift these polls. I identified 4 issues that I think could be kind of key indicators for these polls. One is, and this is a very simple one, how do you feel about Donald Trump? Because if you ask people in the United States, nobody has a neutral answer on how they feel about Donald Trump. Everybody has a feeling about Donald Trump. So that's you either don't like him or you do like him. How do you feel about having the first female president of color in the United States? Again, this is a very divisive question. Some people feel very strongly, or rather most people feel very strongly on that question. Another question that Americans are deciding that Idris alluded to is the issue of reproductive rights and whether abortion should be codified into law, which is what future President Harris would like to do and what Biden wanted to do when he was still in the race. Very divisive. And of course, the other one is conflict in the Middle East, which people feel very, very strongly about. And any one of those could contribute to who's going to win this election. We just don't know.
Indeed. Anita, we should speak again when the polls begin to take shape, and then we can discuss who is possibly going to take over the White House in the coming weeks. Anita Powell is White House correspondent with Voice of America. Thank you so much for talking to us.
My pleasure.